I'm Xena Ugrinsky. I'd like to thank SVG and TAB for having me again. I've been doing this quite a bit lately because I've spent all of my career essentially on analytics-enabled transformation. And pretty much across every industry. So whatever's happening, I get to see it, and there are just challenges that are bubbling up that are consistent regardless of the industry that you're in. And what's interesting about what's happening in AI is everybody seems to think this is something brand new, right? It's a rip and replace. It's not. It's actually more about ideation, right? We finally have the technology that allows us to do the things that we've wanted to do for decades. I think my first exposure to neural networking was in 1987, just to give you a sense for, well, how old I am, too. But I'd like to just walk you through some of the learnings that I've gotten over the last 10 years in being involved in this industry and share that with you today. Hopefully there are some things you can take away from that. So first of all, we all know that there's a tremendous amount of spend that's going into this space. Now, the reality is that I believe this chart actually significantly understates the cost of this transformation that we're all rolling into because it's not just about the technology, right? So today, AI has become a catchphrase for sort of anything having to do with machine learning, neural network, deep learning, etc. But what we're missing here is that the advances in data science that are being applied today really also just enable data mining, right? And you don't actually hear much about data mining anymore, but that's really the first step into sophisticated machine learning. And in chasing some of the cool solutions that are out there, we're missing the thinking necessary to not just apply AI to what's cool and what's coming out. We all hear some of these really interesting use cases, but the reality is it's going to transform our entire organizations. So it's kind of like we've, gone from riding a bicycle directly to trying to fly an F-14 jet fighter, and as a result, we're sort of ignoring the interim steps going from crawling to walking to running to flying. And we're going to have to address those things. And many of those obstacles are things that we've sort of given short shrift to, as we've adopted technology. Why do technology applications fail? It's because you haven't brought the people along with it. And you haven't figured out how broadly to apply it. So it means that as you guys are trying to think about how to create new content for your customers or the infrastructure that you need to build in order to do that, whether it's automation of media asset management, et cetera, we also have to think about how to cost effectively exploit those new assets across every function in the organization. So in reality, we're really in early days in AI right now. Technically, there are only three things that AI can do. It's advanced analytics and automation, it's visual image processing, and it's natural language processing. So far, that's it. But it's the combination of those three that allows us to do some very interesting things. So what does that mean for our organizations? Well, if you look at the left side, those are the companies that have already begun to fully exploit the data economy. They were built to do that. And then the rest of the organizations across every industry fall into the other two categories. And what we see is all the way on the right-hand side, everybody's experimenting with AI. I mean, every department has somebody who's spun up an AWS instance, whipped out a credit card to do that. taken a Coursera course and anointed themselves the data scientist of the organization, right? The problem with that is that ultimately you've got this proliferation of people who are all doing experiments without a cost-effective way to analyze what's happening across the entire organization. So there's no collective strategy behind it. And so ultimately, these folks on the right are going to have to get to that. The people in the middle have already had some successes in point solutions and have already begun to think about how their organizations are going to transform holistically as a result of that. So let me give you an example. The Sleep Number bed, right? Started out as a bed that went up and down on two sides. Then evolved into a bed that could adjust firmness for each person. And now what they've done is they've embedded hundreds of sensors in the mattress with the intent of having the bed automatically adjust. If you start getting restless, it knows your most comfortable sleeping position and will automatically adjust to that. But that's not the vision, right? The vision is to ultimately take that data and combine it with your Fitbit, your Apple Watch, biometric information that might be available to you in order to alert you to the fact that you may have had a sleep apnea event that you didn't even know you had. You might want to get checked for. But ultimately, really severe things like, is that data telling you that you should be checked for a cardiac event? Right? So they have successfully gone from being a mattress manufacturer to a data company that happens to collect data using the thing you're sleeping on. So let's look at some of the macro trends today. First of all, we've heard a lot about this so far today, the macro trends in cloud, in massive compute, in storage. AI, as we think of it today, and particularly for the sports industry, for example, is enabling new revenue generation, revenue preservation through the better use of the video that y'all are storing. But it's also giving you a better understanding of customer desires, things that will, for example, reduce your customer churn and enable you to create new data products to offer to your audiences. In the first panel, you heard Daryl and Brian talk about the reduction in massive manual effort around metadata tagging. And then in the Sony case, how production workflows are going to be automated. And but what's happening today is that everybody is coming up with these point solutions. Okay, so I can assure you that your CIOs, your CTOs are starting to think about how do we bring the tools that we are using to create new content, and how do we exploit that for operations, back office operations, finance, sales, marketing. Okay, so, as you guys are thinking through your infrastructure choices, what's your biggest problem? Funding, maybe? Right? If you can start demonstrating more broadly how the things that you are putting in place can benefit the rest of the organization, it makes it a far easier business case. And then we've got the future of work, right? Everybody's worried about, what will that job loss look like? Because there will be a job loss. The challenge is how do we bring the workforce along and create people who understand how to interact with the technology. We don't all have to be data scientists, but we need to know how to work with data scientists, how to, at a very high level, understand what they're doing, so that as we think about what are the biggest business problems that we're trying to solve today, that we can have those conversations with the people who can make it tangible for us. And then we've got the explosion of solutions, right? I mean, just look outside. All right, just to give you a sense for the scale of all of this, 3 years ago, this chart was half the size, right? That's just going to continue. Of course, there'll be consolidation, acquisition, et cetera, but, if you're trying to understand the state of technology today, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's the use of analytics, whether it's enterprise solutions that are coming up, it gets to be a tough slog as an executive to try and figure out what's real and what's marketing. So how do you go about getting started? I covered this in a book I just wrote called Enterprise AI, Your Field Guide to the New Business Normal. I came up with this because I was working with a semiconductor chip manufacturer, one of the big ones, who was trying to figure out how do we educate our workforce, how do we solve our biggest problems, or the problems that we always, our guts told us we could solve if we could only ... right? The thing is that technology has now gotten to a point where pretty much everything is possible. So how do you decide which problem to solve first, or which new asset that you can create through data is going to drive the most revenue or the most eyeballs? So it's a pretty simple concept. First, you have to collect all the problems that you'd like to solve or the opportunities that you think exist. Then you need to rationalize them, right? Which one are you going to do first? And you're going to do it on the basis of feasibility or cost or materiality to your organization. And then you have to determine, do you have the data with which to do that? Do you have the skills in-house to do it? So sometimes you're going to have to go outside. Right now, I think we're at a point in time where having a guide through that process helps you accelerate it, but you want to build those skills in-house and be very familiar with what these things can do. And then you're going to want to prototype it. And by prototyping, I don't mean run out and buy a lot of infrastructure. I mean use open source wherever you can, right? Fastest path to proving out the hypothesis. And only then do you decide what technology to use. What have you invested in? What do you already have? What strategically do you want to get to? Right? It's got to fit into your ecosystem because this is not a rip and replace. This is something you're going to have to implement and connect to everything else you have. So, just going back to some of the earlier conversations, standards, I think we're 10 years away from, sort of ubiquitous standards around this. But internally, you do have to think about what those standards might be. And then deploy. This is where the rubber really hits the road, right? I can tell you about, $100 million implementations that just wound up delivering no value. Why? Because they didn't bring people along for the journey. So you want to communicate the why broadly. You want to celebrate the successes and make sure that those propagate across your organizations, that everyone's aware of it. Building internal champions who can start thinking, how might that apply to my area of the organization? And the last piece is, people don't understand that these solutions are very brittle. Okay, so if it's a predictive analytic, that makes it a whole different ballgame because these algorithms tend to degrade over time as you're adding more and more training data to them. And so that means that people have to continue to monitor them in order to ensure that they maintain their efficiency, that they're doing what they were supposed to, etc. So we've all heard about the obvious constraints around the search for talent, but there are so many more that are happening right now. So the assumption at the executive level is that this is sort of just like traditional analytics. It's not, right? From a usage perspective, care and feeding of the math in addition to the technology, and then taking that understanding and creating a strategy that takes into account the things that you need in order to put a realistic plan in place that can be accomplished. And this will allow you to put a plan in place that goes beyond a few point solutions, but also has a mix of short-term and long-term initiatives. Why? Because long-term initiatives often take too long. Sometimes they get canceled because they're not showing ROI quickly enough. In fact, one of the big banks had 150 data scientists that they just assumed were going to create magical things that were going to bring in a ton of revenue. And when that didn't happen in the first year, they started disbanding the group. And I'm seeing a lot of that, actually, in the industry today. The next one is that most organizations don't understand the conglomeration of roles that you need. It's not enough to go out and hire one data scientist or even 150. Right? You need data architects who understand the new technology. You need infrastructure people who can support it. But you also need business people who are actively involved in the beginning stages of this so that you don't go down a rabbit hole or wind up like the bank that wasn't showing adequate returns on the investment. And then having folks, right now, because it's early days, it's really important to have folks that sort of sit between technology and the business who speak both languages and can interpret, if you will, in order to make sure that you're not spending a lot of cycle time just on that as a problem. So do you do it as a shared service for the entire organization? And this, particularly since this is a technology-focused crowd, the operating model that you're going to need in order to sort of propagate this as quickly as possible, because whoever gets this done first wins, right? This is how important this is going to be. And so I'm finding that the hub and spoke model, so initially a shared service, and then building teams that you can propagate out to the various lines of business, has been a very effective way of approaching that. And is anyone here old enough to remember data warehousing? 90s? So about 25% of data warehousing projects failed because the first thing everybody did was say, okay, let's cleanse all the data first. 2 years later, no data warehouse, right? There's a similar situation happening, and we heard about it this morning, the whole tagging situation, master data, metadata, right? We're going to have to focus on automating as much of that as possible because, to the earlier point, you may have it, but if you can't find it, it's useless to you. And lastly, a true understanding of the risks associated with what's happening today. So monitoring those risks, we're going into an increased role of governance, privacy. For example, at some point, how many people are just tagged in your content that don't want to be? So the data privacy regulations that are happening in Europe, GDPR, I believe those are heading our way, inevitably. And so we're going to have to start thinking about the mechanisms by which we monitor and manage that kind of governance, that kind of risk, and then sort of the algorithmic bias that we're about to go into in terms of some of the other applications of data. At any rate, this is going to be probably the most massive human transformation that any of us have ever seen before. So as you go through your work and you're trying to figure out, this is all about ideation, innovation. We're all in this together. But as you're thinking about how to build new things for your organization, immediately think about what other areas of my company might this be useful to. Okay. But this is going to be a fun ride, and enjoy it, right? Learn as much as you can and have fun with it, because it's going to get crazy. Thank you.